Okay, so this is Unit 2, Lecture 4. This is the cerebral cortex. So today we're going to finish labeling the brain and the parts of the brain. Tomorrow we'll talk about the endocrine system, and then we'll get into nature versus nurture to wrap up this unit. So far we've talked about what a neuron is. We've talked about the nervous system. We've talked about the inner brain. And today we're going to talk about the older brain, the more developed brain, the more advanced brain that we have here. So let's start with the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex is everything on the outside of the brain. It's this 1/8 of an inch skin, if you would, that goes around the outer brain. So the cerebral cortex is kind of the outside of all of these lobes that we'll talk about: the frontal, the parietal, the brain, the temporal, the auditory cortex, temporal and auditory cortex is the same thing, the temporal occipital lobe, all these things. But the outside of it, the very thin membrane on the outside, this is the cerebral cortex. And remember, we talked about all these interneurons on the outside, and we talked about billions of connections. This is sort of where they're going on. The larger the cortex, the more adaptable the creature. If you take a look at a rat's brain right here, very smooth, very tiny. If you took a rat's brain and you flattened it out, it would be about the size of a postage stamp. If you took a monkey's brain and flattened it out, it'd be about the size of a postcard. If you took a chimpanzee's brain and you flattened it out, it would be about the size of a piece of paper. And a human brain would be about 4 pieces of paper spread out. And this is why, if you take a look over here, and you'll notice the modern human brain is very curved, but has all these sort of valleys in it and everything else. It's so that it has more surface area. We don't have bigger brains, but we have more surface area due to all of these interneural connections that are happening. My dog's barking right now. I think an Amazon guy's here. So that is, and again, the human brain has become more efficient over time. As you'll take a notice here, when it comes to brain weight compared to body size, humans are a little bit on top. And when you take a look at these other mammals, whales, hippos, elephants, etc., these are some of these smarter animals, as opposed to, you get down here, and a little bit less intelligence. So again, the human brain has become more crumpled. It looks, because its functions have become more advanced, needing more of the cerebral cortex, but the skull is the same size. And again, the overall brain has gotten smaller. It's just become much more efficient over time. Now, another little neuron thing that we need to talk about within these interneurons are these things called glial cells. Glial cells are also known as the nanny neuron, because their job is to basically ensure that the myelin sheath that is connecting these neurons is free of scleration and everything else, so that it can get these communications going across. Again, the myelin sheath, we took this cord and we said it was kind of the fiber around the cord. You want to make sure that those messages can get across. That is the job of the glial cells. And you've got like 7, 8, 9 glial cells for every neuron. Now, what's also interesting about these glial cells is that not only do they clean up the neurons, but sometimes they will also interconnect neurons, which means it's very possible that some of the messages that are coming and shooting across neurons can also shoot across these glial cells as well. And another type of glial cell that you have within this is what is called microglial cells. And the job of a microglial cell is to actually, if that neuron is no longer healthy, if that neuron is dysfunctional, if that neuron is harmful to your health, its job is it will actually eat the neuron and destroy the neuron. This happens a lot during adolescence as we become much more efficient in our brain, which makes some connections stronger because it gets rid of unnecessary connections. Again, and I'll use this example at other times. When I was a little kid and I had all these phonetic sounds that were known to man, when I was a little kid, I could roll my R's. I'm sure I could. I don't remember, but I'm pretty sure any kid can roll their R's. But since I haven't spoken the Spanish language effectively, I haven't needed that. So as a result, that neural connection has gotten pruned away. So sometimes when we're learning a new language, one of the things that we have to do is we have to learn to re-enunciate words, because a lot of these past things that we haven't used have basically been destroyed. Trauma or abuse in youth could impact the effectiveness of these cells. And sometimes maybe it doesn't get rid of something that it should. Depression could be the result of underactive cells, again, not efficient in the communication. Now, let's take a look at different parts of the brain on the outside. The cerebral cortex on the outside of the frontal cortex is what's known as the prefrontal cortex, but the actual entire lobe is what is called the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is the most evolved part of the human brain, and it is what makes us different from so many more creatures. It is the last to develop. Your frontal lobe will not be completely developed until you're about in your early 20s. By the time it gets there, girls a little bit sooner. This is our ability to recognize future consequences. This is our ability to go, how will my actions impact others? It's choosing between good and bad actions. It's impulse control. It's doing what's right when the right thing is difficult to do. When you get to the end of the day as a teenager and you think to yourself, why did I do that? Because you don't have a frontal lobe. When a kid is doing something stupid, you got the little boy with the nails hammering it into the coffee table, and the parent's like, what are you doing? I don't know. The phrase, I don't know, that comes from a kid in junior high, elementary school, and sometimes high school is so honest, because a lot of times we're doing stuff as kids, we just don't know why. The impulse control is really, really low, but the need for simulation is really, really high, because the frontal lobe is not really developed to sort of balance these two out. This is useful in complexities of learning a task before we transfer it to the cerebellum, where it's automatic. So when I do this thing again and again and again, I practice it in my frontal lobe. Then once I got it, I shoot it down to the cerebellum. It becomes more efficient. Emotional control is also a little bit in the frontal lobe. Now, the amygdala is the emotion alertness, but the control of our emotion is in the frontal lobe, which again is why a 2-year-old can have a tantrum, because they have little to no frontal lobe development. So their emotions of fear and anger and whatever else could be completely overtaking their body. You know, the reason why sometimes a young kid can't have empathy. The little kid will walk up to the stranger, you're ugly, not thinking of how that's going to affect somebody else when they hear that. You can't see things from other people's perspective without the frontal lobe. This is also why, we'll talk about down the road, sociopaths, psychopaths, murderers have less frontal lobe ability. And we start to see this. Kids who aren't really affected by punishment. If I don't fear the punishment and I don't fear the consequences and I don't care what anybody thinks about me, why would I change my behavior? Low development in the frontal lobe in both psychopaths and sociopaths of antisocial behavior. When you take a look at here, this is the normal frontal lobe brain activity. This is the frontal lobe of a psychopath, not nearly as active. This part of a brain, again, not fully developed until the 20s. The rest of your teenage brain is fully developed and on fire by the time you're 12. So your hypothalamus and everything, I want, and your amygdala of what is that? They're all on fire. They're working, but the part of your brain that could actually control it and make sense of it is about a decade behind. This is the later maturing part of the brain. It's a recent phenomenon. Past generations, what is the right information we're looking for? Pretty easy to do because we're limited in how much information is going in. Today, you have so much information coming in, it's about eliminating unnecessary information. And that takes a little bit of time to develop that, okay? This contains the most dopamine sensitive neurons of the cortex. And again, this is why teenagers can also be susceptible to depression, because the lack of development in the frontal lobe, it's harder to understand emotions, feel emotions, or sometimes these emotions become overwhelming. You don't have control of the emotions. You know, you ask the 13-year-old girl, why are you crying? I don't know. You ask the little boy, why are you punching him? I don't know. And a lot of times they don't. So during times of stress, the frontal lobe may completely shut down. while the limbic system works into overdrive, again, making teens susceptible to anxiety. And it goes offline when we're dreaming. That's why all these wild things can happen. All of these things that where I can do things I would never do when I was awake, and I'm doing or I'm being punished in ways that are fearful of things that I would never be. This is the explanation for immoral and irresponsible actions, not only in our dreams, but when we're awake and our frontal lobe isn't quite taking over. Uh, you know the difference between right and wrong, but you have difficulty regulating this behavior. Again, I don't know why I did this. 25% of men on death row have a history of concussions or injuries to the frontal lobe. This is also why it's a big debate of when kids should start playing contact sports, helmets, all these things. It's the last part of our brain to develop. And again, with impulse control and all these other things, and we'll talk about this more when we get to adolescence. Um, and this was, as a father of kids, this was sort of the first aha moment I had as a father of teenager. And I would just go, they don't have a frontal lobe. It's the last part to develop. And it could be impacted by stress as a fetus, impoverished conditions as a child. It's just very important part of the brain. And this was sort of discovered back in the 1800s. A gentleman by the name of Phineas Gage, who we talked about before when we talked about case studies. Phineas Gage is working on the railroad back in 1848. All right. And while he was working on the railroad, there was explosion that happened. And a spike, this spike right here, this is actually Phineas Gage holding this spike. This spike went up and pierced. It went up his, it went up his cheek, and it blew out the top of his frontal lobe. You'll see right here where the spike sort of goes through, and it just sort of destroyed it. And it just flew out, and he was patched up. And he was back working later that day after this thing basically torpedoed through his brain, and he was even drinking coffee and spitting out parts of brain. The brain has no sensory neurons, so it can't feel pain. And what they started to notice about Phineas is he started to act a little bit different. He lost his moral compass. He started to steal. He started to swear. He was less patient with other people. He wouldn't do the difficult thing. He was always looking for the easy way out. And this isn't how he was acting before. Now, again, back then, he just sort of, people noted it. Stories were told. He went off and joined a freak show. And when I say a freak show, he joined the circus, pay a dime, see the guy with the spike who went through his face. But now when we look back at it and you dig up the body and you look at the skull and you see that it hit the frontal lobe, you sort of make this connection, when you had the technology to do this and realize that was frontal lobe damage that happened there. All right, so that's all prefrontal cortex. Now the occipital lobe, which is also known as visual cortex, is right back here. It's the back of the brain, octi-eye occipital lobe, right back there. This is where the main part of vision goes through. Okay, now again, vision is processed everywhere, but the main part of where vision is processed is back here. Where did I see it before? How does it make me feel? What am I hearing versus what am I seeing? So all parts of the brain are lit up, but the main part of it is right back here. So my eyeballs go right back here. That's my occipital lobe. It works in conjunction with other parts. Now, sadly, some of the greatest advances in mapping out the visual cortex happened during World War I because they made what was called the Brody's helmet. The Brody's helmet basically only covered up to here to stop things from coming down, but it didn't cover back here. So as people got shot through the brain and through the occipital lobe and survived, but were losing parts of their vision, doctors were able to map out during World War I a pretty accurate part of which part of this brain is responsible for which part of visions and which part of the eye is taking in that information. So again, occipital lobe, octi-eye, right back here. Your temporal lobe, which is right by your temples. If these are my temporal lobe is right here. My temporal lobe, also known as the auditory cortex, is responsible for hearing. So everything that comes through the left ear is processed on this side, and everything that comes through the right ear is processed on this side. This interprets semantics, sound, and also helps out with vision because how I see something affects how I hear something and all these other things. This is thought to work with the hippocampus and encoding long-term memories, and we'll get more into that when we get to memory. So again, auditory, audio, temporal lobe right at the sides takes in that information. The parietal lobe is the problem-solving lobe, which is right up here. You'll see it right there, which also includes the sensory and motor cortexes in front of, or behind the frontal lobe there. This helps us with spatial abilities. This helps us in manipulation of objects and sensing things with the sensory motor cortex as part of it. It helps us with problem solving, higher mathematics skills, doing a Rubik's Cube, which I have right here. Still can't solve this. Need to look up YouTube. But all of that is discovered in the parietal lobe. And as you continue to exercise it and doing problem solving, it will actually grow in the same way that the amygdala will grow through trauma, through problem solving. The parietal lobe would grow. Einstein's parietal lobe was a little bit larger than a normal brain's parietal lobe. And he also, to relax, he would play the violin, and that motory sensory function would also help his parietal lobe. And this is one of the reasons why high schools have musical programs, because the manipulation of the instruments and everything else is great practice. This is why we have sports programs, because again, the manipulation of the body and leadership is great practice for problem solving. Dogs again, I think somebody's coming home. The sensory cortex, that's my temporal lobe that took that information in, and my parietal lobe, nothing I can do about it. My frontal lobe going, whatever, it's the dogs, they're just being nuts. Someone's probably going for a walk. Anyways, the sensory cortex is part of the parietal lobe that's right here, okay? And this is what is called in here, the blue, the somatosensory cortex, right connected right to the parietal lobe. This is what's taking in information. So as I take this marker and it touches my hand, that sensitivity of feeling the marker on my hand, that from my right hand, it is going to my left sensory cortex, which is responsible over here for feeling. So again, the sensory cortex over here taking care of the right side, the sensory cortex over here taking care of the left side. This right here, you'll see this dude is pretty much broken down. The bigger the body part, the more of the sensory cortex it's dedicated to. You notice he has huge hands, huge lips, everything else, because those are responsible for taking in this sensory information. If we lose part of our body, we lose a foot, we lose a hand, we lose a finger, whatever, our brain will rewire so that other parts of our body can take over. For example, if you're amputated, say right below the knee, all the sensory cortex that are responsible for the calf, the foot, the ankle, and all those things will eventually get rewired to make the bottom of the knee more sensitive, which isn't naturally sensitive, so that when a prosthetic is put there, you can use it more efficiently. The motor cortex, on the other hand, is the part of the parietal lobe that is responsible for telling the body what to do. Again, you see right here, this is motor man. You see really big hands and really big lips because more of the motor cortex is dedicated to the hands and the lips. And what's interesting about this is that it can be manipulated through surgery, which, by the way, the sensory cortex as well. You know, if you had somebody doing open brain surgery on someone, you could stimulate part of the sensory cortex. And if the patient is awake, and a lot of times they are awake during these surgeries, and you stimulate part of the sensory cortex, they can feel like pressure on their hand, even though there's nothing there. And it's the same thing with the motor cortex. You can actually stimulate parts of the brain, which will cause people to do particular actions. Michael J. Fox, is actor from Back to the Future, who was suffering from Parkinson's disease, was having some open brain surgery done in Canada, and they would stimulate part of his motor cortex and his arm would just like flip right up. And he's like, how the hell is that happening? Because of the stimulation that the doctors were doing. And so by studying the motor cortex, scientists can predict the movement 1/10 of a second beforehand. You ask somebody to snap their fingers with their right hand, and the left side of their motor cortex will light up 1/10 of a second before that snap occurs, because that's the command. And then it's the action that goes on down here. Okay. And there's motor man and sensory man right there. Now, all this part of the cerebral cortex out here that is responsible for this is what is referred to as gray area. Gray area is the higher functioning parts of the brain, and it's 3/4 of the human brain is the cerebral cortex, which is there for higher level thinking. We have more gray area than a chimpanzee, a rat, or a cat. Very little higher thinking going on with them. As an owner of 2 cats, I can tell you that to be true. So 3/4 of the human brain is gray area, which allows these higher levels of thinking. And as you get older, here's at 5, 8, 12, 16, 20, you'll notice there is more and more and more and more gray area, which again is why a 5-year-old thinks differently than a 12-year-old who thinks differently from a 20-year-old, which again is why in the study of psychology, we've got to look at these different parts. Okay, so the sensory inputs, the stored memories, all this stuff that comes together is the associations that happens in this gray area. And this is why this drives me crazy. When people go, you know, you only use 10% of your brain. That's not true. And I don't care what movies you're seeing, and I guess it can make an interesting plot or whatever else. You use way more than 10% of your brain. You use all of your brain. Anybody who thinks you only use 10% of your brain, give me 90%. Let's see how your day goes. Right now, I'm in my house. Okay. This house is a few thousand feet. I'm not using all of my house at the same time, but I still need it. When I pick up this pen, I'm only using these muscles at this particular time. The rest of my body is not flailing around as well. It's more efficient. I might not use all of my brain to its capacity at the same time, but I need all of my brain. Okay, I use all of my brain to get to a memory. I've got to go to the memory of how did I see that? How did I hear that? What did I smell? What did I taste? What did I, whatever. And those memories are located all over my brain. We use all of our brain. Very, very important. Gray matter, a little bit of information there if you want to take a look at that. All right, let's talk about neuroplasticity. This is the relearning of the brain. When you think of plastic, plastic is something you can take and you can recycle. If this calculator suddenly were to break down, I could take it, recycle it, they could melt it down, and they can make a new calculator, or they can make a pen out of it, whatever. The brain is the same way, okay? We used to think that when somebody, let's say, lost their vision, and we used to think that the occipital lobe would just go dark, but that's not what happens. The occipital lobe, if we lose our vision, the occipital lobe goes, oh, well, I'm not going to be used for vision anymore. What do you need me for now? And so what the occipital lobe will do is it will start to be able to process Braille. It'll go towards the sensory cortex, and it'll help the sensory cortex process Braille in a way that a blind person can process Braille much faster and much more efficient than someone who doesn't. As a matter of fact, studies showed a blind woman who suffered a stroke to her visual cortex, it affected the way that she felt, even though it was her vision, because she had rewired herself to go that particular way. Physical therapy, speech therapy, it's retraining lost learning of the brain. I am currently going through something called, this is my dog, I'm going to beat the hell out of her. I'm currently going, come here, come here, come here, come here. Come here, come here, come here, come here. This is the little loud one right here, who I'm going to start to beat up, who's breathing heavy because she's yelling at the mailman. Anyways, right now I'm going through neuroplasticity. The neuroplasticity that I'm going through is because I had some oral surgery done about 2 weeks ago. And after the oral surgery and something was added onto the inside here, I developed a lisp because there wasn't as much movement in my mouth that I was used to and whatever else. And right at the end of it, my speech was greatly affected. But what's happening, especially as I'm doing these lectures from home, I'm forcing myself to talk. I'm rewiring my brain. I'm rewiring my tongue. I'm rewiring my mouth. I'm rewiring my jaws on how to pronounce words differently than what I have for 53 years. And again, it just goes through doing it again and again and again, rearranging those neural connections, all those sort of things. Someone who develops a stroke has to go through physical therapy. You break an arm, and you got to make those reconnections. All of that is neuroplasticity of the brain, some stuff there on neuroplasticity. The story right here of this young girl, whose name I forget, and it's not written on there. She was having seizures, continuous seizures going on in her body. And a seizure is when there's an overstimulation of electricity, which causes convulsions and everything else. And these seizures were actually threatening to her. So what they did was they took this young girl and they actually lobotomized, took out half of her brain. And they thought, well, that's it. She's going to be paralyzed on one half. We'll see how it works, whatever. And what they discovered was, since she was so young, she was 6 when it happened, the right side of her brain took over for what was missing from the left side. It didn't happen overnight, but through training, physical therapy, and all these other things, she was able to retrain her brain. That's the plasticity of our brain. Some other stuff there on neuroplasticity, if you'd like to pause and take a look at it. Now, let's talk about the left and right brain, because again, here is another sort of myth that we have. I'm a left brain person. I'm a right brain person. You are a full brain person. You use all of your brain. It's just that some parts of our brain are a little bit more efficient at processing certain things. The left side of our brain tends to be a little bit more logical. The left part, logical. This is where language comes from. This is where linguistics and speaking comes from, writing, mathematics, all these things. The right brain tends to be a little bit more emotional, recognition of faces, relationships, all those particular things. Now, again, when you take a look at letter recognition, the recognition of what letters are, left is a little bit more active, but the right is still active because it's memories of seeing that particular thing. Face recognition, the right is a little bit more active because faces tend to be emotion, but also the logic of what is the name. So again, it's one side tends to be a little bit more active, and specialization saves from having to cross over because that's 0.25 milliseconds that it takes to get across the brain. A little bit more efficient. Now, an example of this, when we take a look at these two brains right here, let's move this down here. All right. These two brains, this one and this one, are both, this is kind of hard because I'm not doing the mirror here. Both of these brains that are looking at you are the exact same picture. They're just flipped open. So you take the exact same picture and you copy it and you open it up. So this half of the face here on the left side of his brain is now on the right side of his brain and vice versa. Now, that being said, it's the same emotion, it's the same face, but does one of these two faces look just a little bit happier? And do one of the two faces look just a little bit more sad? Most people looking at these two faces would say that this one looks a little bit more sad. This one seems a little bit more happier, even though they're the exact same mirror images of faces. So why? Well, over here, I'm taking in this part of his brain with my left eyeball. Now, again, this would be if I was facing it. This kind of screws it up here. But as you look at this, your left eyeball is taking in this part of his face. Your right eyeball is taking in this part of his face. Your left eyeball taking in this sadness is going to the right emotional side of your brain. Your left eyeball taking in this happiness is going to the right emotional side of your brain. So your emotional side of your brain sees this as a little bit more sad and that as a little bit more happy. Not completely, just a little bit more. All right. Now, when it comes to the left side of the brain, there's a couple of special parts in there. One is called the Broca area. The other is called the Wernicke area. The Broca area is located right here. The Wernicke area is located, let me move myself, is located back here. Broca, Wernicke, B comes before W. My dog's again, I think my wife is on. Okay, so with the Broca area, this is responsible for making sounds, babble, speech. That's the Broca area. So when a baby is learning to say words, whatever the muscle movements, etc., that comes from our mouth, that is the Broca area. The Wernicke area, which is more closer to our temporal lobe, this is the part of our brain that is responsible for making speech, making words, etc. That's the Wernicke. Wernicke area is for understanding speech, taking speech in, comprehension of speech. So Wernicke area, what I hear, Wernicke area, making sense of that. Broca, closer to the frontal lobe, babbling what I say. Now, for someone who suffers from aphasia, which is an impairment of language, this is usually caused because the left hemisphere is damaged to either the Broca area, which impairs our speaking, or the Wernicke area, which impairs our understanding. Some people who have lost speech due to a stroke in the Broca area regain it through signing, which is controlled by the right side of our brain. Now, when it comes to processing language, women tend to use both the left side as well as the right parts of the brain when it comes to processing language. It's a little bit more of both brain. Men tend to use, I'm busy, just a second. Men tend to use only the left side to process language. And again, this is why women are better at getting things like body language, reading signs, emotions, stuff like that. It's why women use more words when they're explaining things, where a guy has a person a few words. When a woman tells a story, it tends to be more words than when a guy tells a story. When asked to do only creative right brain activities, such as rhyming, men also tend to only use the right side of their brain. The corpus callosum, last couple things we got to talk about here. The corpus callosum is the last thing we label, and it's this guy right here, which communicates from the left side of the brain to the right side of our brain. This connects the two brain hemispheres. So these are where messages are coming across from one another, where the left can communicate with the right can communicate with the left. If your corpus callosum right there is damaged, that means that your left and right side of the brains cannot talk to one another. So you kind of are experiencing, depending on which side of the brain you're paying attention to, you're kind of experiencing two different worlds. Remember, we put the finger out there, left, right, left, right, left, right. I've got two different images coming in. It depends on which one I pay attention to on how it's coming to me. Now, if somebody is split brain, and a split brain person is someone who had damage to their brain, so the corpus callosum was basically severed to stop having seizures or whatever, these two cannot communicate with each other. So let's see what happens when someone has a split brain. So they're asked to look at this picture right here, and then you flash the word heart, H-E-A-R-T, heart. Okay, so the left eye is picking up this and the right eye is picking up this. You combine it and you make heart, which is what most of us will do. Yet, if you are a split brain person and I asked you, tell me verbally, what word did you see? You would say, I saw the word art. Why? Because it's language. Language is the left side of my brain. And what goes to the left side of my brain is what I see with my right eyeball. So my right eyeball sends it to the left side of my brain. Tell me what you saw. I saw art. Point with your left hand to what you saw. I would point to HE, because my left hand would point to what my left eyeball saw, which is processed in the right side of my brain. If I asked you, point with your right hand to what you saw, that would be art, because that's the right eyeball that I saw that with. That's what a split brain person would do. Okay, real quick, left-handed people. Let's talk real quick about this, as my left-handed wife is home right now. 10 to 15% of the human population is left-handed. They are wired differently. 50% of lefties process speech in the left hemisphere, but the other 50% in the right hemisphere, which is different from other people. 25% of them will process it only in the right, 25% will use both. There's social injustices of being lefties, and if you're left-handed, you know this. Tools, scissors, all these sorts of things that are designed for right-handed people. Cars are more likely to get into accidents if you're left-handed, because a car was designed for right-handed people. Desk, if you're sitting in a classroom desk and your right hand can rest on it, lefties can't do that. They've got sort of that gap. Notebooks, writing across it, all of these things are disadvantages for lefties. Now, lefties also have advantages. 6 of the last 14 presidents have been left-handed. Hoover, Truman, Ford, Bush, Clinton, Obama, all lefties. You tend to thrive in one-on-one things because a lot of righties aren't used to dealing with you. Now, as a result, left-handed people do have a little bit less of a lifespan due to more likely to get into car accidents and things like that. But also there's a lot of advantages to it as well. Some other stuff there on left-handed people if you'd like to continue to read. That's it. That takes us through all of that. Next thing we're going to talk about is we'll talk about the endocrine system, and we'll talk about hormones, and we'll also talk about ways that we study the brain.